So as you all know, from the letter that the presiding bishop and I sent to you yesterday morning, General Convention will now take place July 7 to 14, 2022 in Baltimore. These dates provide for an 8-day legislative convention, 8 legislative days. We'll gather several, as we always do, we'll gather several days in advance of the official beginning of convention for the usual preparatory meetings. And as the executive officer, Michael Barlowe of Province 8 in the Diocese of California, will explain that there is a possibility that we'll be able to add a 9th day of legislative business pending ongoing conversations with the Baltimore Convention Center. These dates mean that we now have an extra year between general conventions. And in 2021, we'll take advantage of that extra time to try 3 new things. First, during the summer of 2021, we'll hold an online convocation of worship and prayer to help us hear what the Spirit's saying to the church as we prepare to gather at General Convention. And of course, the presiding bishop will preach. Second, to make the best use of the adaptive moment now facing us, we will appoint, meaning the presiding bishop and I will appoint legislative committees in 2021, charging them to begin their work virtually using the new online and Zoom skills that we've all gained this year. And I'll say more about that later. In 2021, we'll also hold an online election to choose the members of the Joint Nominating Committee for the election of a presiding bishop, so that that group will have ample time to complete its work before the 81st General Convention to be held in 2024, same schedule, in Louisville, Kentucky, when the church will choose a new presiding bishop. Inevitably, the course of the pandemic and this unexpected opportunity to try new things that mean that we'll have plenty of communication and updates for you along the way. For the remainder of the triennium, although I keep wondering if maybe we should call it a quadrennium or an Olympiad, please make sure that you watch your email for the House of Deputies monthly newsletter and for other information and correspondence from my office. And beware of social media misinformation. I lost track of how many times people posted speculation that the General Convention would be totally online, even after the presiding bishop and I wrote to all bishops and deputies in July, outlining clearly the 2 in-person alternatives we were considering. In a few minutes, I'll talk more about how we'll continue to do the work of governing the church between now and 2022. And certainly Michael Barlowe will have quite a bit to say about that. But now I want to introduce, welcome, say hello across the pond to someone you all know well, General Convention Executive Officer, Canon Michael Barlowe. Michael.
Thank you, Gay. And it is so wonderful to be with my friends in California. Some of you know I'm actually, not that I'm complaining, but I'm stuck in Scotland. So I've been here for a bit, and because we're all working virtually, it's been fine except for unusual hours. But I can't tell you how much I was originally looking forward to coming to be with you all physically. And then when circumstances changed and all of our lives changed, it's wonderful to be with you here virtually today. And I was glad to hear my friend Warren talking about other opportunities for Province 8, and perhaps there'll even be other opportunities for the deputies in particular, closer to from California, and I'm sure from the province, to gather, because one of the things that is important, I think, for all of us to recognize is that we don't at this particular moment, have all of the answers about everything. It's very much an evolving situation. But as I told my colleagues yesterday, after Executive Council approved the new dates for the physical meeting of the General Convention, the 80th General Convention, I said, okay, now the work begins. And there was a lot of chuckles because I don't think there's been a single, in fact, I know there's not been a single day since early March when Gay and Michael Curry and Executive Council and certainly the staff of the General Convention have been working hard, and Betsy Bell on the president's staff have been working so hard to try to put together in a new creative way the millions and millions of pieces that make up the meeting of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. I want to tell you a bit about what that meant, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. But I think that you all, because I know you all well, I think might be particularly interested in some of the specific things that we had to do in order to reach the presentation that we made yesterday, or the decision that was made yesterday by Executive Council. And I think you'll appreciate some of the concerns. I mean, obviously, in a convention the size and complexity of the General Convention, we start planning General Conventions 7 years in advance of their physical meetings. 7 years is what the lead time is. Obviously, we're juggling several General Conventions at a time, but that's how long it takes. And because of that, you won't be surprised to hear that we have to sign contractual obligations and so forth that are signed years in advance. And those of you that have been involved in such things know that they come with penalties and all sorts of other kinds of things that we were particularly anxious, I was particularly anxious to try to mitigate any potential financial and other liability for the church. And without going into the details, I can say that it was not the major concern. I'm actually going to get to the major concern in just a moment, but it was a major concern to try to be good fiduciaries, good stewards of the resources of the church. From my point of view, and I think you all will agree with this, the one thing that was in my mind every single day, and like you, I'm sure like me, I'm sure you have friends and family, maybe you yourselves have found this to be not only difficult time in all the ways that we're aware, the health challenges, the isolation challenges, and so forth, but many people have lost jobs. Many people have had a hugely negative impact on their lives because of the pandemic. And you all know, and many of you have voted over the years for the policies of the church, of the General Convention. And I know that you all walk day by day what lies behind those policies, the understanding of the dignity of all people, the desire of the Episcopal Church to support equality among all people, and the issue of employment, fairness across the board, especially in areas such as the living wage and so forth. One of the biggest concerns that I had in the midst of the 125 or 30 different negotiations that started out in March were the jobs of the people who clean our rooms, serve us meals in restaurants, clean the convention center, all of the kind of things. Some of the lowest paid members of society who would have been negatively impacted by choices that the Episcopal Church might make. So that was hugely important. Some of you know this. I said this to Executive Council yesterday, but there's, and many of you know how this is done, but there's a way economically that the multiplying effect of holding such an event as the General Convention can be determined. And both we and the city of Baltimore reckon that the economic impact on the city of Baltimore for the Episcopal Church meeting and general convention is north of $20 million, and it probably lies between 23 and $25 million. An enormous impact on a city. And you all know that Baltimore has had its share of difficulties over the last few years. That would have been a devastating thing for them. We were one of the largest economically speaking, conventions that Baltimore ever gets. So it's a huge thing. The good news, and I won't continue this, but I wanted you all to know some of those complexities. We had to work through all that and all of the legal implications. Many of you are attorneys or know the law well about these kinds of things. We had lots of things to work on. The good news is that with the great help of the wonderful people of the city of Baltimore and the hotels and the Diocese of Baltimore, Diocese of Maryland, and friends locally and anybody and everybody, we reached a position really just within the last week that allowed us to, for me to be able to tell Executive Council yesterday that we believe that we're going to be able to achieve the new dates without significant and maybe even no financial impact, negative impact on the Episcopal Church. And at the same time, we've been in a position to guarantee, to the degree that guarantees can be made about jobs and so forth, and our impact on that for the coming years. So that's one of the reasons why it took so long for us to get to where we were. I know that some of you probably were frustrated by, well, why don't you just make the decision? Why don't you just announce what's going to happen? And goodness knows, we all would have loved to have been able to do that. But these are some of the concerns, these two things that I've mentioned, were some of the reasons why it took so long. But I hope you'll agree with me that it was worth the wait for us to be able to get the good news that the presiding officer sent out yesterday after the decision by Executive Council, but also the important 2 points that I've raised. So now I'm going to, and there may be questions about that later on, I'm going to now kick it back over to Gay.
Thank you so much, Michael. As I mentioned earlier, the presiding bishop and I will appoint both deputy and bishop legislative committees in 2021, charging them to begin their work virtually using the new online and Zoom skills that we've all gained this year. But I am going to tell you, and this will be a disappointment, is that the committees will not be able to be as large as they have in the past. So there will be fewer bishops on their committees and fewer deputies on the HOD committees. So just want to give you that heads up. I anticipate, we're still working on the timetable, that we'll release the list of legislative committees for the 80th General Convention early in 2021. And in February, send a survey to all of you so you can indicate your preferences for serving on legislative committees. By April or May, I hope that we'll have the legislative chairs and officers appointed, and later in the spring be able to publish the rosters of the legislative committees. We'll spend the summer training chairs and legislative aides and secretaries, and I very much hope that the legislative committees will be able to begin work sometime in September or early October. While I suffer, perhaps like you, from Zoom fatigue, I have renewed gratitude for the ways that our newfound online skills are allowing us to undertake this experiment and beginning the work of legislative committees long before we arrive in Baltimore in July of 2022. We'll have about 9 months for the legislative committees to do their work, which means that instead of coming to convention and waiting for a couple days for any substantial or substantive resolutions to come to the floor, we should be able to go, do that right away the first day. And the other great thing about technology is we'll be able to have online hearings where anyone can attend. In the past, in order to attend a hearing, you had to be physically present in the city where we were holding a general convention. So we'll actually be able to increase the level of participation. So I hope it'll mean more time to consider the important legislation before us, more opportunity to hear all sides of the issues from voices across the church, and better use of our legislative time once we come together at General Convention. Now, like anything we do for the first time, I imagine there are going to be some bumps in the road and some things we want to do differently in the future. But I'm glad we can take this step in adapting General Convention to the times in which we live. Some of you may have been wondering what postponing of General Convention means for people serving in various offices that are elected by General Convention. My Chancellor, Sally Johnson, has done exhaustive canonical research on this issue, and I'd be happy to answer any specific questions you have about this issue during our Q&A session. But in short, all of the officers of the House of Deputies serve until the conclusion of the 80th General Convention. So until we convene in Baltimore in 2022, I will continue as president. Byron Rushing will continue as vice president. Michael Barlowe will continue as the secretary. And this is also true of a host of other offices. But again, if you want specific information, Michael and I can respond during the Q&A. There's always a special case, right? And this time it's the Joint Nominating Committee for the election of a presiding bishop. At the 2018 General Convention, we amended Canon 121 to change the composition, size, and manner of election of some of the committee's members. And that amendment took effect January 1st, 2019. And the amended canon provides for 20 members, 5 clerical members, at least one of whom is a deacon elected by the House of Deputies, 5 lay members elected by the House of Deputies, 5 bishops elected by the House of Bishops, and 2 persons aged 16 to 21 appointed by the President of the House of Deputies, and 3 persons appointed jointly by the presiding bishop and president of the House of Deputies to ensure the cultural and geographic diversity of the church and the skill sets necessary for that work. Because the composition of the committee changed substantially, as did its size and manner of election, it isn't practical to have the members elected in 2018 continue in office. And it's also not practical to wait until July of 2022 to elect the committee, since its work typically takes 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years. And presiding Bishop Curry's term ends on a date certain under the canons, October 31st, 2024. So in order to elect members to serve on the committee as it's now configured, and in order to give them sufficient time to work, we will elect members to the Joint Nominating Committee for the election of a presiding bishop online during 2021. So watch and that election will be facilitated by the General Convention office, by the executive officer of General Convention. So watch your email in the new year for more details about how we'll accomplish that work. Just 2 last quick things. I do want you to know about, if you don't already, that because of the postponement of General Convention, I've begun a series of webinars for deputies and alternate deputies. We started in September with Pete Buttigieg, then that was July. And then in September, we had two former deputies, Deputy Jennifer, now Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs of Indianapolis, and Deanne Johnson, Bishop of Missouri, with a conversation with them. Then just a couple weeks ago, we had a terrific webinar with Professor Scott McDougall at CDSP on the theology of governance. And all of these webinars are now posted on the House of Deputies Facebook page, and I believe on YouTube as well, but we can make sure you all know what the links are for those. And in January, we will have another Californian. Ruth Myers of California will be with us to give an historical overview of liturgical and prayer book revision, which is of course something that will be important at the 80th General Convention. Before I turn it back over to Michael Barlowe to tell you more about the work of preparing for General Convention, I want to mention one other new thing that we deputies will do at the 80th General Convention. Some of you may know that in 1970, 50 years ago, 29 women, lay women, were seated in the House of Deputies after a second reading of an amendment to the Constitution to allow them was approved by both houses of General Convention. They took their rightful place in the governance of the church after a debate that began in 1913 and included the seating of one woman for one convention in 1946. That act galvanized opposition that lasted for nearly a quarter century, and included the appointment of perhaps one of the most aptly named church committees of all time. Created in 1949, it was called, and I kid you not, the Joint Commission to consider the problem of giving the women of the church a voice in the legislation of General Convention. Its report is in the Journal of the 1952 General Convention, and all the journals are available online through the digital archives of the Episcopal Church. And I can assure you it makes excellent stay-at-home reading. It's fascinating. So the journey from there to here was long and hard. And you can also read about it in Pam Darling's book, New Wine. And you can also find on the archives of the Episcopal Church an audio clip of the proceedings in the House of Deputies on October 12th, 1970 at the General Convention in Houston, when the 29 women were seated as deputies, and President John Coburn addressed the House for the first time with the words, "Ladies and gentlemen." Inspired by the New York Times overlooked series of obituaries, I began looking into how we remember the women who broke this barrier and gave women the vote in the Episcopal Church. The House of Deputies Rules of Order calls for a necrology, what we now call a memorial roll, to be read and entered into the journal of the at each General Convention to honor members of the House who have died. So I do remind you that at some point the General Convention office will send a email requesting those names. But it appears that most of the women seated in 1946 and 1970 were not included, I'm sure for a variety of reasons. So as the first ordained woman to serve as the president of the House of Deputies, it will be my honor to rectify this omission when the memorial roll is read at the 80th General Convention. And I'm glad that you'll be there with me to honor the women who made it possible for me and so many of you to take rightful places in the governance of our church. So now I turn it back over to Michael Barlowe.
Thank you, and amen to all of that. Typically at these gatherings, The next thing that I'd be doing is telling you some of the nuts and bolts of the General Convention, the location, new software, all that stuff. And I'm going to do a little bit about that, but for the reasons that we've articulated already, there's still a lot of things that are unanswered. But the thing that we all now know is that we're going to be in Baltimore, and Baltimore, some of you probably have been to Baltimore. Baltimore is a fabulous city, and where we are meeting is right on what's called the Inner Harbor of Baltimore, which is an extraordinary place. It's got something for everybody. It's got art museums, it's got the Orioles Stadium, it's got world-class dining and fabulous little holes in the wall with some of the best crab soup you'll ever get. I mean, it is just an unbelievable place, and it's set in the midst of one of the most extraordinarily historic and culturally diverse cities in America. We're going to have a wonderful time in Baltimore, and we're going to be meeting some of the fabulous people that I've already had the chance to meet from both the city and from the diocese, who are going to give us an enormously powerful and wonderful welcome, which I think by 2022, we're all going to be looking forward to intensely. So the Inner Harbor itself, for those of you who haven't been there, is relatively compact, at least the part near the convention center. We're going to be in hotels. They're going to be very close to the convention center. The furthest walk that anyone will have to make is probably 10 minutes or so. It's not going to be a big. You're not going to have any transportation problems at the 80th General Convention. The largest block of rooms are going to be at the Hilton Inner Harbor, but there are also significant, and many of the committee meetings will be also at the Hilton Hotel, but will also be at the major room blocks at the Renaissance, which is a beautiful hotel just recently renovated just down the street, the Hyatt Regency, and many smaller ones. We were able, although the rates haven't been determined finally yet, we were able to get some general commitment, which I hope to be able to share with you all relatively soon. But I can say that the cost of hotel rooms in Baltimore is surprisingly affordable. As we all know, many places, many cities, and especially near convention centers, can be very expensive. So I think that we're going to be able to surprise you and your treasurers and your household budgets and everything else. That's certainly what we're working toward. I want to say a few words about some of the work that lies ahead for planning and arrangements, the Joint Standing Committee on Planning and Arrangements, which I chair and which Gay and Michael Curry and most of the senior officers of the Episcopal Church, plus a lot of other deputies and bishops with deep experience sit. And Planning and Arrangements is the group that does the overall planning of the schedule and so forth. And we have a lot of work to do. One of the things that we're going to have to do, as Gay mentioned, is to plan. We want to plan a 9-day legislative session convention, but we've only got 8 days of commitment right now because of other commitments that the city of Baltimore has. So we're going to have to figure out what the schedule is going to be. And most of you will recall that the original plan was for us to have a 10-day legislative session. So we can't just move what we had already planned into that. And that will also have an effect on everything else. So for instance, an enormous amount of work had been done on what we're calling the community gatherings, which will include creative worship opportunities and so forth. A lot of work has already been done, but we're obviously going to have to adjust and recalibrate, not just for different schedules, but also we're going to be in a changed world. And I think nobody is desirous of simply trying to return to what was, quote, normal in the past, but to really try to figure out where God is genuinely leading us in the future. So all of that lies ahead. So we'll be giving giving you all a lot of information. As you heard from Gay, we will, her office through her newsletter, the newsletter of the deputies, will be sending out lots of information. The General Convention office also has a newsletter which serves the entire General Convention, bishops, deputies, as well as the members of the ECW delegations and interested members of the church. We have lots and lots of visitors. We're expecting, by the way, for the Baltimore Convention to be one of the largest conventions in the history of the Episcopal Church. We're expecting north of 10,000 people over the period of time. And there are lots of reasons for that, but particularly because of its location. So it's going to be a great event with lots of planning that lies ahead. In terms of the technology, there will be a lot of things that will be very similar and familiar to you. We did make the decision to continue with providing iPads. I was hoping, and some of you may recall, that I was really hoping that we would be able to allow people to bring their own devices and then provide devices for people that didn't have their own devices. But once again, because of the challenges of this last month and because of the difficulties in trying to solve some of the issues, I made the decision that we would go for another general convention with providing iPads. So you'll get your own iPad again, and but I think you'll find the technology, the software that's included on the iPad to be even more sophisticated than what you saw in the past. And if our software developers who are scattered around the world and who've had the same issue as all of us have with the global pandemic are able to do what we had originally asked them to do, it should be even more integrated into the variety of communications, voting, and all sorts of other ways. We're working toward all that. I can't at this moment promise you that's where we're going to be, but that is certainly where what we're working toward. We are, I think that's all I'll say about that. There's a lot of, and rather than just saying what we're working toward, because things might change and you'll be hearing a lot more about that relatively soon. I would say, as Gay mentioned, because the legislative committees are going to be appointed by the presiding officers a lot sooner than typically we would do before a general convention. One of the things that we'll be having to do and are already working on are making the meetings of the legislative committees we're going to try to make it a seamless, positive Zoom and other online media event as possible. Because one of the things that we're envisioning is that there will be online hearings, for instance, so which Gay has alluded to. So there's a lot of things that we need to work out technologically. So as we've said on a number of occasions today, stay tuned because you'll be hearing more about all that. People have already asked, well, does this mean that the Blue Book deadline is going to be delayed? And the answer is no. And there are reasons for that. Now, obviously, there are some groups that continue beyond the Blue Book deadline anyway, such as the standing commissions and some of the task forces and other groups have within their mandates specific dates. And some of you may have already been in touch with me where we're trying to be flexible. But the reason that the December date is so important is that we still have to produce the reports to the General Convention. And we want them to be available so that as soon as the legislative committees are able to work, they will work on the legislation that our hardworking interim bodies have been producing. We have in place already in broad strokes, how we're going to be able to keep fresh the reports that are being generated right now. And you'll be hearing about that as well as time goes by. But suffice it to say, we're quite aware that there's a long time period between December 1st, 2020 and the meeting of the 80th General Convention. And I assure you that the Blue Book reports will not be stale when they are turned over to the people that will turn them into the legislation that you'll be seeing at General Convention.
Michael, could I interrupt here? Because we have
Yeah.
a very appropriate question, and that is, can you explain a little bit more about what the Blue Book is for our deputies and alternates?
Thank you, and I apologize for getting into in-house lingo. Should have known better. The Blue Book is the colloquial, I think it may even be in the dictionary for Episcopalians, name for the required reports to General Convention. And it's called the Blue Book because at least during my tenure, I returned to the tradition of them being blue. So I'm going to be announcing, and I have to actually send a message to Scott Gunn if he wants to, because Scott usually does a very, some of you know, a humorous story about the release of the particular color. But I've already chosen the color for the virtual Blue Book, and there will be at some point the possibility of people actually purchasing a physical copy if they'd like. And that will be, that color, which I'm very, very pleased about, will be released pretty soon. So that may be an early Christmas gift for some of you. So the only other thing I'd say is that the General Convention and its staff through the General Convention office, or the GCO, as it's often called, the General Convention office. All of my colleagues are there to serve you. There's no question too small, too great. If we don't know the answer, we'll tell you we don't know the answer, but we'll find out, or we'll direct you to someone who does have the information. We're there to serve you in the church. So please feel free to get in touch with us at any time for whatever questions. We'll be producing a number of digital publications which will be invaluable to you, I hope, and in preparing for the 80th General Convention. If you would like to now, in fact, I would encourage you to go to the General Convention website, which is www.generalconvention.org. And it's a very straightforward website. You'll see all sorts of publications and information and links that should assist you in the work that you are going to be involved with as we all prepare for the 80th General Convention. So please feel free to get in touch anytime. Take a look at the publications, Constitution and Canons. When the Blue Book is published virtually or digitally, it'll be up there, all sorts of things. So that's where I want to stop. And Gay, would you like to say anything else? Are we ready for?
No, I think, thank you, Michael. I think we're ready for questions.
We have a few questions in the queue. Cindy, do you want to reflect them back to Gay and Michael?
Certainly. I believe we've answered the questions about the Blue Book. And there was another question for President Jennings about the webinars. And so if there's a link for those that can be shared, she referred to the fact that there was a place that those could be seen. Other than that, we have a question about when will the task forces committees sunset? And then there's another question beyond that, but that's
okay. All right, I'll start with the webinars. The webinars are for deputies and alternates. The registration link appears in the month. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there. I got distracted by the Ohio State game, but they're winning. But in any case, the webinar link. The webinars are always announced in the House of Deputies newsletter. The House of Deputies newsletter and it's announced at least a couple months in advance of the actual webinar. The House of Deputies newsletter comes out, generally speaking, the last day or two of each month. So the link is in that article. And it is closed. It's to deputies and alternate deputies, although I've been known to be generous and let some former deputies or former alternates attend as well. They are available after the fact, recording. If you go to our House of Deputies Facebook page, they're always on the, they're loaded to those pages after the webinar takes place. I'll make sure in the newsletter that's coming out in a few days to have exactly what the links are to watch previous webinars. I think that answers that one. And then there was one about, what was the next one?
When will the task forces or committees sunset?
Okay, before Michael does that, Betsy Bell just did a link. Watch your chat. So there's some links that she just put up. All right, Michael, you want to talk about sunsetting?
Yes. Well, I'm not going to use the word sunset because that actually is has a technical meaning that we use that has to do with how often groups can be renewed and so forth. But and I've written a letter about this, which has gone out. We can redistribute it in part. That once the report to General Convention, once the Blue Book report is completed, for the vast majority of interim bodies, that concludes their work. In other words, after you've made your report to the General Convention, obviously the work is done. Now, in some situations, such as the 3 standing commissions, also in some of the task forces that by their mandate, that is to say by the legislation that called them into being, have things that go on or work that goes on for a longer period of time. But in almost every other case, once the report is made to General Convention through the Blue Book report, then the work is finished. There are some work plans, some deadlines that, because of the lockdowns and the disruption caused by the pandemics, have not been able to be met. And if you're in a group that's the case, please feel free to get in touch with me. As I mentioned, I'm certainly not going to be hard-nosed about some of these things. So if there are good reasons, we will certainly be able to find accommodation.
We have another question on what information is usually contained on the iPads.
The iPads are fundamentally, and someone just privately texted me saying, a new deputy saying, do we get to keep the iPads? And sadly, the answer is no. We did the cost analysis and we'll do it again, but it's actually much cheaper to the church for us to rent them for the period of time we need. So we have to return them. But the software that's embedded on it, and it's done in such a way that it basically makes the iPad a dedicated device to the meeting of General Convention, includes what's called the virtual binder, which is the legislation in its manifold forms that you will be interacting with as a deputy and the bishops as bishops. So, for instance, what will be in that particular software, we call it the LPO, which doesn't stand for anything anymore because we've gone through so many different iterations, but that's what we still call it because we're in the Episcopal Church and we never change things like that. But the virtual binder is really all you need to know in terms of the underlying legislative software that feeds into everything. And as the legislation is perfected and finally brought to the floor of each house, that's where you'll be able to track it, and you'll be able to track the various hearings that might be held at General Convention about pieces of legislation. There'll also be all sorts of information about the convention center, about where meetings are being held. There's going to be an announcement function. There's going to be opportunities this time for a vastly improved app, although we've had pretty robust apps in the past. Technology and software continues to accelerate. So our app for the convention, which will be on the iPad, and you'll also be able to download to your phones if you'd like. All of that is on there. In addition to the software, and I'm hoping that there'll be, as I mentioned, voting and other software that will help us during the legislative sessions that we don't know yet whether that's because of the delays, if that's going to be possible, but we're working toward that. In addition to all of the software, there will also be a lot of publications that you'll undoubtedly want to refer to all the time, including the Constitution and canons, the rules of order, and so forth. So there's quite a lot on it, and there's going to be a new feature that's going to allow, we hope, once again, God willing, and software developers cooperating, we're hoping to have a better way of deputies and bishops communicating within the General Convention through the iPads. So stay tuned on that as well.
I would just add to that is, especially for new deputies and new alternates, there's lots of orientation. You're not just going to be handed an iPad, sink or swim. So you will be have great orientation. And I think there was also a question related to what you just talked about, Michael, is whether iPads are available to alternates.
Oh, and the answer is yes. The iPads are available, will be made available to any registered deputy or alternate.
Okay. Cindy?
We have a question of, will we continue with the House of Deputies news daily during General Convention?
Well, I know who asked that, and the answer, of course, and hope that you will help with it, Jim Richardson. So we have a pretty robust, it really got robust last time, House of Deputies news page on the on Facebook, House of Deputy News, and it's daily news and podcasts and videos and stories every day of convention. We've assembled in the past, a great group of volunteers, including Jim Richardson from Northern California, of journalists and videographers and interviewers, and we fully intend to do that again. We also are planning on expanding Spanish. We had some Spanish, and we had a Spanish podcast. I think Nancy Frausto was involved with that last time from Los Angeles, and we plan to expand our Spanish language offerings as well.
We've had a previous question about logging into creating an account on the extranet, and Betsy was kind enough to post that. So that will be there, and we will make, as Richard Edward just posted, that we will make all of these important links available after the fact for everybody. We do have another question.
Let me add one thing to that. If you have issues with your extranet account login, just email Betsy, bbell@episcopalchurch.org, and she will troubleshoot it. She'll interface with the great people in the General Convention office. She will help make sure that you are fully able to access and log on. Thank you.
I believe the last unanswered question we have at this point is, when will dioceses elect deputies for General Convention 81, 2024?
Beats me. I'll be sitting on my porch in the rocking chair. No. No.
Hardly.
I'll turn to Michael Barlowe.
It's a good question, but because of the delay in the 80th General Convention, but we are not going to delay, God willing, the 81st General Convention. So in other words, the General Convention, the 81st General Convention will be in Louisville, Kentucky in Province 4, as previously announced, in 2024. So the diocese will be electing as you would typically do, whatever your local canons require.
The only thing I would add to that is that the canons require that deputies be elected 1 year in advance of the opening day of the 2024 convention. So my guess is what's going to happen is you're going to go to General Convention, and then in July, and in the for conventions that are either in the fall of 2022 or January, February of 2023, you're going to have to elect almost immediately upon your return from Baltimore.
And as Gay said earlier, the term of the presiding bishop ends in 2024 on October 31st, 2024. So we will be electing a presiding bishop. So we're even though it's just 2 years, that's one of the reasons why we're going to go ahead. And there was never any serious discussion about delaying the 81st General Convention.
Betsy Bell just helpfully said that only deputies need to be elected and certified 1 year in advance, because often alternates are elected thereafter, but hopefully they'll be elected as soon as possible, because otherwise they don't receive any news if we don't know who they are. So.
Right.